Tonight we're going to be discussing James chapter 2. Hopefully we'll get through the chapter of James chapter 2. We took 2 lessons to do chapter 1, and I would love to say that was by design, but it wasn't. It's just because I'm slow. But I really would like to get through chapter 2 tonight, if we can. Would you pass one more down there, please? Thank you. Did everyone get a handout? Okay. The first chapter, in my estimation, is kind of an introduction to the rest of the book. And so it's very important that we understand what James is trying to say in the first chapter. Hopefully we all have an understanding of that now. And so we can understand that what James is going to talk about in the rest of this book are the trials and temptations that these Christians are dealing with. And that the important thing is for them to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And the important thing for them is to practice true religion, which is a religion of doing. And he gives the specific examples of visiting the orphans and widows in their affliction and keeping oneself unstained from the world. That's a very important distinction there. And so we want to get into the details of what James is going to talk about. And the first part of that is the sin of partiality. And that's in verses 1 through 13. I'd like to begin by reading verses 1 through 13 of James chapter 2. Again, this is from the English Standard Version. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, "You sit here in a good place," while you say to the poor man, "You stand over there," or "Sit down at my feet," have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which He has promised to those who love Him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? If you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. All right, I think I saw a couple more people come in, so let me get 2 more of these sheets out. There you go. Could you pass one more of these down, please? Thank you. All right, so let's discuss this section here about partiality. Now, the first comment I've made on the lesson sheet here is it's hard to change a leopard's spots. And I'd like to look over at Mark chapter 10, 23 through 31 to see why I say that. This is a story from the life of Jesus, of course. And Jesus had to deal with a similar attitude here. And it's kind of a lengthy reading, but is there someone that would be willing to read that for me?
Then Jesus looked around and said, "This is like the how hard is it for those who have riches to enter the kingdom of God?" And the disciples were astonished at his words. And Jesus answered again and said to them, "Children, how hard is it for those who suffer riches to enter the kingdom of God? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." When they were astonished beyond measure, saying among themselves, "Who then can be saved?" But looking at them, Jesus said, "With men it is impossible, but not with God. For with God all things are possible." Then Peter began to say to him, "See, we have left all and followed you." But Jesus answered and said, "Surely I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or land for my sake and God, who shall not receive a hundredfold now in this time houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and land with persecution and in the age to come eternal life, for many who are first will be last and the last."
Okay, and of course, verse 31 is the point that Jesus is trying to get across. The last will be first, many who are first will be last, and the last first. But look at the attitude that these Jews had toward the rich, especially when Jesus says it's difficult. How difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. And you can almost hear the crowd say, "What?" Because they said they were amazed. They were amazed that he would say something like that. And then he makes the comment about the camel going through the eye of the needle. They said, well, who could be saved? If the rich man can't be saved, who can be saved? So this was the attitude that they had toward the rich. They believed that the rich were those that were, I suppose, blessed by God. And the question that I have here is, why were these presumably Jewish Christians, because we've talked about that this is probably who James is writing to. Why were these presumably Jewish Christians so enamored with the rich?
Because the doctrine of health and wealth is not a new doctrine.
Okay, all right. So what do you mean by that?
Well, the attitude is out there, and as a matter of fact, I had a friend wrote on Facebook that they had reconsidered the idea of tithing, and there were a whole bunch of comments on down there, and I gave up on it. I commented a couple times and then gave up on it, because one of them in particular that struck me, he was saying, yes, if you give to God, God's going to just send out blessings that you just can't believe, and that's not God's promise to us. It's not this thing like an advertisement I saw, I gave $50 to Pastor so-and-so and I wound up with this brand new Cadillac. God gave me this Cadillac. Well, that's a Ponzi scheme. God's not in the Ponzi scheme business. Now, if we give to God like we ought to, He will bless us with what we need. And He has promised us that. He isn't going to always give us what we want, and He isn't going to give us fabulous wealth. But He blesses us with what we need. But these people thought, wow, these rich, they must be doing something right. They were getting blessings in this world. And of course, to the Sadducees, life is all about this world because there was no afterlife.
Good point.
And so the rich, especially to a Sadducee, had to be somebody favored by God, because this is the only place we can get our blessings.
Okay. All right, thanks. Were you going to say something, Mike?
Well, maybe that's, my thought on this is a little different. I mean, this is the kind, you can see this kind of favoritism in churches today. I mean, I have known people personally who did this. They will compare, various people in the congregation to each other based on the size of their contribution checks. This person's really valuable. We've got to convert this many so-and-sos to equal one this.
Okay, all right.
And so now it becomes that you treat the members who give bigger checks and who have more means and have greater funds as if they are, better Christians because they bring more to this church.
Okay.
We want to hold on to those people.
All right.
But we don't care so much about, Joe Schmo over here who, puts in a nickel every week or something.
Okay, all right, and so that's a good point that we can relate to today. Back in those times, yeah, I think we see the attitude of the rich are the ones that are, they've got it made. God's apparently blessed them. They must be doing something right, like Mark said. But then the other idea is we treat the rich better because they can do more for the congregation. Or,
They can treat us better too.
Okay, and it may be, I don't know, I have a feeling this is talking about members of the church that come into their assembly, but it may be people that are visiting. They're in the synagogue after all, it says. They may have people, Jews that come in from outside that are rich, and they're like, oh, we got to convert him, He can put some more money in the plate, and he can, we can do more with his money. So, perhaps that was the attitude. But there's lots of reasons for us with our worldly thinking, the wisdom of the world, to treat the rich differently, to treat them better. And that was certainly what was happening here. Now, James says something very interesting, and I've overlooked it so many times, and then it hit me. In verse 1, he says, he calls Jesus Christ the Lord of glory. Now, why would he refer to Jesus in this way, in this passage, do you think?
Glorious Lord Jesus Christ. Well, think about it. Jesus, who he was somebody who would not have been considered glorious by this world. He was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor. And, yet James calls him the Lord of glory.
Right.
I guess Paul calls him the Lord of glory too. But
Right. Right. It just seemed interesting that here James chooses to call him the Lord of glory when he's talking about who did they think was glorious? Well, it was the rich. It was the one with the fine clothing and the ring on his finger. But Jesus, was he a rich person? No, he wasn't rich at all. He said he had nothing. He had not even where to lay his head, he told one man. And so, but he is the Lord of glory. And so James is trying to change their thinking, just like Jesus was in our passage in Mark chapter 10. And he says, many who are first will be last, and the last first. Sounds like something else we read that James said. In fact, the next question, what have we already learned about the lowly and rich from James? In chapter 1, verses 9 through 11.
This man will pass away just like all the rest of us. His riches will not help him by all means.
All right. Those riches don't mean anything. As a matter of fact, the lowly brother has whereof to boast in his exaltation. This sounds kind of like what Jesus said. The last will be first, and the first will be last. Okay. So now, in skipping ahead to verse 5. So he says that he talks about their attitude toward the rich and the poor, and how they have the rich sit in a good place, and they tell the poor man to go stand over there. You smell, whatever they were saying. But they wanted them to be away from them, not in the good places where the rich people should be. And he says they're making distinctions among themselves and becoming judges with evil thoughts. And of course, they're judging between those who are rich and those who are poor. And apparently judging that those who are rich were more worthy than those who are poor. So he calls this judges with evil thoughts. Now, so he shows them the error of their thinking, beginning in verse 5. And he says, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom? Now, is James suggesting that only the poor in the world will inherit the kingdom? If God's chosen them, doesn't that mean they're the only ones that are going to get it? What does he mean there?
Wasn't he chosen them also, just as much as the rich?
Okay,
Well,
that's true. Yes.
it might be a reference here in the Beatitudes. Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Okay.
It's those who are humble, those who don't trust in their physical possessions, but those who are ready to empty themselves of their physical possessions, in a spiritual sense, and say, I'm just like everyone else.
Okay. All right. Excuse me. And it does say in Matthew 5:3, which I've made reference to here, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Sounds a lot like what James is saying. What were we going to say, Wayne?
Well, I mean, even in James itself, in James chapter 1, the brother of humble circumstances is to boast in his high position, and the rich in his humility is poverty, basically. And, well, how is a rich man going to boast in his poverty?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing with Jesus. Jesus was, as rich as you could get, and yet he made himself poor for the sake of his brethren. He completely emptied himself, for their sakes, for our sakes.
Okay. So, skipping down a couple of questions. So, can a rich person be one who is poor in the world? As James puts it. And if so, how? Yes, Don.
You can be poor in character.
Poor in, what do you mean by poor in character? You have a poor character, like you're a bad character?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Healthy at the same time.
Okay, all right.
Treat people like dirt.
Okay, all right. So that would be a negative connotation of the word poor. But in this case, we're talking about the poor that God has chosen. What does it say? The poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom. So that's, yes, Don.
Well, you made reference to the centurion in Acts chapter 10.
Okay. You noticed that, did you?
He obviously wasn't poor from a financial point of view,
Okay.
but his attitude towards God was humble. And that's I think is exactly what James is talking about, and that's what Jesus talks about. That it's our attitude towards what we have. Is we get it, or God give it to us, and what are we to do with it when we have it?
Right.
And where did it come from? Did we earn it, or did God give it to us?
That's a good point.
Those are the issues that James is talking about, and that's the attitude.
Yeah, and I would encourage you, we won't look at it now in the interest of time, but I would encourage you to look over at Acts chapter 10 and just reread verses 1 through 8 and see who the centurion was. You could say, well, he got all his money, all of his wealth and everything from the government. He was a government employee. But it says when he sent the servants to go get Paul, two of them, I think it was two of them, maybe it was just one, but one or two of them were his own personal servants. They weren't part of his guard. So he does seem to be a wealthy man, but it says he gave alms to the people, and he was humble, and God heard him. God heard his prayers. So in this way, I believe this is an example of a rich person that is poor in the world, or poor in spirit, you might say, and someone who is rich in faith and an heir of the kingdom, as it turns out. Now, any other comments on that before we move on? Okay. Verses 6 and 7, James says, you've dishonored the poor man, and then he talks about how the rich oppressed them and dragged them into court and blasphemed the honorable name by which you were called, which would, of course, be the name of Christ. Is James himself guilty of partiality here by suggesting that all rich people are evil?
It does sound discriminatory.
It kind of does. It's not politically correct, is it?
Sure it is,
It
because
is.
that's rich people today.
That's right. That's right. It is today.
James wasn't saying here that all rich people are this way. He was using hyperbole.
Right.
He said you prefer the rich people, but whenever you get hauled into court and sued, who is it that's doing that to you? Well, it's a rich businessman
Yeah.
who thinks you've crossed him or something.
Yeah.
he's saying the poor people out here that are just poor as dirt. In India, it'd be the untouchables. They're not the ones that can do that. They're the ones who can't do anything against you.
And so, what honor is there in being rich? There's nothing that is honorable about being rich, in and of itself. Yes. Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you, so are you trying to tell me that in verse 5, poor of the world means poor in spirit, but in verse 6, poor means don't have money?
No, the principle is kind of it's parallel.
The idea is more that James is not making an absolute statement here.
Yeah.
About, every person who's got a big bank account figure is, acts this way. Every person who doesn't have a big bank account figure acts this way. That's not his point. His point is that, you shouldn't show partiality to these people.
Okay.
That's a real issue.
All right. Yeah, that was my point, and I apologize if I drew too strong a parallel there. My point, I think the point James is making is that those who are poor in the world, now I'm stuck.
Are more likely to be poor in spirit?
I think that was the point I was trying to make, although it's not gelling in my head right now.
Perhaps it would be good to say that that's an example of the kind of poor that we're talking about.
Yeah.
The ones that are poor in spirit. The ones who don't think highly of themselves because of their material possessions.
Yes.
What it really boils down to.
Yes. Thank you. And that's the thoughts that I had, and they're just not.
Did that come out right?
Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking. Yes.
Well, Jesus makes the same point throughout his ministry, and you get to this. He makes a statement, for instance, about how his mission is to preach the gospel to the poor, quoting from Isaiah 61. In Luke 14, whenever he talks about when you give a banquet, you invite the poor, the people who can't pay you back. He tells the parable of the man who he's throwing a feast and he invites all his friends and they all make excuses of why they can't come. And so his response is to go out and invite the poor and the blind and the lame and the crippled. He says, I'm going to populate my hall with these people and fill it up because not one of them is going to taste my dinner. Well, Luke's drawing a pretty clear contrast between the rich and the poor. The Judaistic mindset of that day was that only the rich people are going to get in because they're the ones that are favored by God and blessed by God, and clearly they're the most important people who can do the most for the kingdom. But Jesus says it's the opposite of that. He says the rich man's it's like going through the eye of a needle. It's, and really it's the poor that Jesus spent all his time and his attention on, in many instances anyway.
That's true. Okay. I need to give that some more thought, but I think I understand what I'm trying to say, and it's just, and I think you guys are saying it, but I need to make sure that maybe we'll come back to that next week, and I'll explain it a little bit better. Okay, well, in the interest of moving on and trying to get through chapter 2, hopefully, I just want to move forward to. Okay, I want to move forward. There's a few questions I'm just going to skip here, but I want to move forward to this idea of the law. And he says, first of all, he says, he who said, do not commit, this is in verse 11. In verse 10, he says, whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. We understand that. You can't sin in one point and say, I'm a keeper of the law. If you sin in one point, then you've broken the law, right? I can't rob a bank and say, well, I didn't murder anybody while I was doing it, so I didn't break the law. Well, you robbed the bank. You broke the law, right? So it's the same idea. He who said, do not commit adultery also said, do not murder. So if you do either one, you're breaking the law. Now, is he accusing them of murder?
No, just not of being as perfect as they were.
Okay, all right. Now,
There's a lot of things along those lines in chapter 4. It's the source of quarrels and conflicts among You're envious, you can't have, so you commit murder, he said.
Okay, all
I
right,
mean, flat out accuses them of it in chapter 4.
all right.
Probably not literal.
Not literal murder.
Says
He calls them adulteresses.
Jesus said the man that says to his brother Rachel has committed murder.
Okay.
So
All right. So in a way, I mean, you could think that according to 1 John 3:5, if you don't 3:15, if you don't love your brother, I think it says if you don't. Well, let's turn over there and look at that. 1 John 3:15. Thought I had it in my head, but apparently I don't. 1 John 3:15 says. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. And so, in a way, they've shown a lack of love toward the poor among them by honoring the rich among them, by elevating the rich among them. And so, in a way, this might be what he's referring to by saying, if you say, I don't commit adultery, but you do murder, but you're still a transgressor of the law. But the larger point is that they are supposed to speak and act, in verse 12, as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. Now, we talked about what the law of liberty is. It's the law that gives us liberty from sin, our past life of sin. So the law of liberty, I point out here, next to the last bullet point, the law of liberty frees us from sin, but do we deserve to be freed from sin?
nope.
No, that's grace. By God's grace, we are under the law of liberty that frees us from sin. We deserve death. The wages of sin is death. So the fact that we are not dead is due to mercy. God's mercy. God has chosen not to judge us and find us guilty of death by His mercy. So, as it says in verse 13, mercy triumphs over judgment. I think this is what James means when he says that. So, does everybody see my point there? Mercy triumphs over judgment. Yes.
Well, never mind. That's just an observation I noticed.
Okay.
People always want to talk about how James and Paul are so different.
Yes.
And, this is actually one of the points where they're so alike in many ways.
Yes.
Galatians 5 and verses 13 and 14. You have been called to freedom, brethren. You've been called to liberty. Mm-hmm. Only do not use your freedom for an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in you will love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. That seems like, that it's almost the exact same point the two of them are making. Everybody wants to focus on how they're different.
Yes.
This is one of those instances where
Yeah, and if you ever see a difference between James and Paul, it's usually because they're looking at it from two different directions. They're looking at the same thing from two different directions and focusing on two different aspects. All right, so the last question under this section is, why does our judgment under the law of liberty demand that the fact that we're judged under the law of liberty, demand that we show mercy to others? Now, I point out Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. That is the parable of the servant who owed his master money. And just in the interest of time, I'll summarize. The servant owed his master money, and then he went out and he forced his fellow servant to pay up. And the master found out about it and threw him in jail, right? So, the servant that was forgiven did not in turn show mercy. Correct? So, the question, why does our judgment under the law of liberty demand that we show mercy to others? Yes. Right. Because God showed us mercy. Because we are under this law of liberty, God has shown us mercy. We should show mercy to others. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. When we judge our neighbor, our brother, because they are poor, or for whatever reason, we judge them to be worth less than everyone else, then we are not showing mercy. I believe is James' point. Yes?
isn't mercy for the undeserving?
Yeah.
So I don't understand why these poor people were any less deserving of kind treatment than rich people. I'm just not sure
Well-
what mercy has to do with this.
Well, that's a good point. I'm not sure how to answer that. Because you're right, mercy is for those that are undeserving. So is James saying that those that are poor, even though they don't deserve, for us to give them mercy? Is that what he's saying?
Well, by the same contrast, we ourselves don't deserve mercy either.
Right? Yes, Don?
You can sum it up with verse 13.
Okay.
Her judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy.
Okay.
It's our attitude. It all boils back down to that attitude. Our service to God and how God treats us.
So I think,
So whether you got a ton of money or no money or whatever, the idea is those godly attributes are those things that we have to have added to our character.
okay, all right, yes.
We're not supposed to be the ones to say we deserve it, all right?
Right?
We just have to do what we're supposed to do and let God handle it.
Huh.
It doesn't matter if they deserve it or they don't deserve it. You can be poor and still be nasty to people and have it.
That's right.
So I just feel like we just supposed to do it for others, but anybody can do that. $1 million if you got $0, and then you let God sort that.
Okay. Wait.
Well, I mean, we're commanded in Luke 6 and verses 36 and 37, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. And so there's this question of, and he goes on to talk about how the standards that you use will be applied to you. So if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, well, how many flaws are you willing to tolerate in yourself? Well, you're usually willing to tolerate a lot more flaws in yourself than you are in other people. But that's the problem, isn't it? If we're going to be if we want to have mercy shown to us for our problems and our sins, we need to be willing to show forbearance to others who are committing those same sins that we would show to ourselves, and show that same kind of mercy to them.
Okay. So, how much more mercy do I deserve than my rich brother or my poor brother? None. Right? None of us deserve mercy, right?
Exactly.
But we all receive the same mercy from God. And I think maybe that's James' point, is that all of us, it doesn't matter if we're rich or poor, all of us receive the same mercy from God. And that makes us all the same in His eyes. And so we ought not to be going around that and being less merciful than God and saying, this man deserves a good seat and this man doesn't. Yes?
Let me ask you a question. How merciful would any of us be had we not come into a relationship through obedience to the gospel? How merciful would I be without participating in the mercy that God has given to me? And we all need to ask ourselves those questions too. And then I think we have a basis for dealing with other people too. And we think in those terms, how do we relate to other people? And how willing are we to extend mercy to them? How willing are we to reach out? That's mercy. Teaching them about salvation. I don't know.
All right.
If that makes much sense either.
Yeah, and it reminds me of our point earlier about, is he talking about fellow Christians, brethren that come in that are rich and poor, or is he talking about people from the outside that come in that are rich and poor? And it doesn't matter. They all deserve the same mercy, We ought not to be saying, well, we need to convert this rich guy, so he can put more money in the plate. It doesn't matter if he's rich or poor. Everyone deserves the same mercy, So even if you look at it from that point of view, it makes sense. All right, well, have 5 minutes. Can that faith save him? We may never know. Let's read verses 14 through 26 and see how far we can get. Maybe we get a head start on next week. All right, so James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, "Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God." You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. All right. Hit a couple of these points before we're done here. So, my first point is, apparently these Christians like to talk about their faith. And we've already seen that back in chapter 1, where it says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, that person's religion is worthless. Why? Because they didn't have pure and undefiled religion. They were talking. They weren't bridling their tongue and doing. They were hearers and not doers only. And so here he hits that point again. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? And I said, what other group liked to talk about faith but didn't do much about it? And I'll leave you to look at Matthew 23. Yes?
I think you're losing the
Yeah.
That's just a guess.
Okay. All right. I'll leave you guys to look at Matthew 23, verses 1 through 12, and you'll find out that Don was right. All right. So first he gives an analogy, and I called it wishing a destitute brother well. Now, so, the idea is that someone who's hungry comes and says, I'm hungry, and I don't have good clothes, I'm cold, and I just have so many needs. And you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for you. I hope things go well for you. See you later." Yeah, I'll pray for you. And or maybe even let me know if there's anything you need. It's like, well, I need food and I need warmth. All right. So they don't. So in other words, you don't do anything about what they need. Right. Now, so is James trying to teach us how to take care of the poor here? Is that his point? No. James is using that as an obvious thing, right? It should be obvious to us how to take care of the poor. You fulfill their needs. You help them. And what good is it if you don't? So James is trying to show that faith without works is dead. What does he mean by that? Faith without works is dead. Useless. There's nothing to give it life. All right? Just like what he says in verse 26. As the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. You go to a funeral and there's the body laying there and you say, I hope somebody says at my funeral, "Oh, look at Dennis, he looks so good." Well, that's not Dennis. That's Dennis's body. There's no spirit there. It's a useless body. All you have to do is put it in the ground or burn it up, or that's all it's good for. There's no spirit. to give it life. Yes.
Another way of putting it would be, let faith lack value versus a faith that has value. I guess, I think I like that one better.
Okay. All right.
Use those as useful.
All right. Good. Yeah, this is probably not a good analogy, but I just thought of a bank account that doesn't have money in it. I don't know. It's a weird analogy, but you could say your bank account is dead if there's no money in it, I guess. It's not worth much of anything. Okay, well, we are past our time, so I'm going to close up there, and we'll continue on in chapter 2 and hopefully get into chapter 3 next time. And, you'll get to your class eventually, Wayne. I appreciate the time. And I really appreciate the discussion. Even the questions that challenge me, especially the questions that challenge me. Let me say that. I really do appreciate that because I just get one viewpoint as I go through and look at this stuff. And every now and then I talk to Gail about stuff, and she helps me out. But sometimes I don't talk to Gail about stuff, and I find out that she had some really good points. So I appreciate that. And if you've ever got anything you want to challenge me on, please feel free to bring it up. Thank you.